did 500 years ago and the change that was sparked and the movement that happened, it's hard for me not to think about how our world today seems to be changing a lot and how it has changed a lot. Do you know what I mean? Have you noticed this around you? I mean, some of it's in little ways, some in big ways. One place I was faced with this recently is that I grew up in a small town not far from here in eastern Iowa on a family farm. And when I was in high school, which was a while ago, I used to do a lot of work on the farm, and I was very familiar with it, but I was never very good at it. You can ask my dad, he'll testify to that. And so I went off and did other things. I went to college and did some work in the church and seminary and stuff like that. And then this fall, for the first time in about 15 years, I found myself back around home, and my dad has needed some help in the field, and so I've been back in the saddle, so to speak, relearning how to drive a tractor. And some things have changed, I noticed. Back when I used to drive a tractor, it was a very small, modest thing that you would sit outside and kind of freeze this time of year. And now I drive this thing with a nice big cab, and it has heating and air conditioning and a CD player. And it actually has like a leather seat instead of a steel seat. It's very nice. But beyond that, it has this little computer box in it that I'm told talks to a satellite in outer space and connects to the tractor and automatically steers it across the field for me. It's like my dad doesn't even need me. It's crazy. This is nuts. And if you're in farming, this doesn't sound very strange to you. But if you've been out of the game for a while, or you're not from that world, and someone tells you, oh yeah, the tractor drives itself thanks to a spaceship floating up in space. What? This is not the world that I grew up in. This is not the world that my grandfather started farming in. In fact, my grandpa was well known to turn that button off on that machine that he didn't like and drive the tractor the right way back when he was trying to do this, which ironically looked a little more like this when I went across the field, but to each his own. I mean, our world is changing. Family is changing a little bit. I mean, just a generation or two ago, it seems like people most commonly would define family as sort of an extended family, aunts and uncles, cousins, grandparents, all kind of living near one another and part of each other's daily lives. And now that's less and less common, and it's more common now that kids grow up and maybe go to college somewhere or get a job half a country away. Our own children live half a continent away from their grandparents and know each other mostly through things like Skype and video chatting on a computer. I mean, this is not the world that was there a couple decades ago, is it? I mean, even technology keeps moving so fast. I have this little thing in my pocket. It's called an iPhone. You may or may not have heard of it. But it's like, I have this thing that's supposed to be a phone, but really it's a set of encyclopedias and a library and a TV, and a little person on here told me how to get to this church this morning while I was driving. It's fantastic. And can you imagine, though, taking an iPhone back 50 or even 100 years ago and trying to explain someone back in time just that far what this thing was? They would think you were an alien from another planet and run you out of town. Our world is changing so rapidly. And today we celebrate the work that Martin Luther did 500 years ago and others that sparked this Reformation. But the thing was, it wasn't just the church that changed during the Reformation. It was everything. I mean, the way people thought about things scientifically, culturally, music, art, our place in the universe, everything about how human beings are kind of changed and got flipped upside down, and it launched us as humans into the modern era. Now the thing is, our world is rapidly changing today, and there are many historians and people who study like cultural movements that would argue that right now in our lifetime we're living in the middle of the next great Reformation. That we are living on the hinge point between two distinct eras of human history. The one that Martin Luther birthed, the modern era, is fading away, and whatever else is coming next that's kind of foggy and nebulous and not yet to be known, we live right in the middle of that. And so, if it seems like our world is changing at this crazy rapid pace, it's because it is. And we can look back at things like the Reformation, and we can celebrate that with a good hearty potluck and some brats, and we can look back and say, way to go, Martin, we think what you did was fantastic. Good job. But when we live in the middle of it, it can be a little bit confusing and challenging and even scary at times. Because one of the things throughout human history that always seems to happen when there's this kind of mass shift and change in human history is that social distinctions rise up. As we're trying to find our way and navigate these new waters, these boundaries and these distinctions rise up. And when they do, it's these cultural rules and expectations about how we are in a society. And when the clear social distinctions fade, the way we used to understand ourselves, when those things fade in these times of change, we seek them elsewhere. And if we can find something to grab onto, people hold onto that and cling to it with this wild ferocity. And it becomes this brewpot for fear and discomfort and anxiety and even anger and hatred. Does that sound at all familiar, like maybe when we turn on the news today in the world? Why is it that our issues of today seem to be so polarizing, so much more intense than they were just a few years ago? Well, these social distinctions rise up, and I think that this is where our gospel reading intersects in such a powerful way with our life and reality today, now. Because this could just be a parable about being humble. And on one layer, that's certainly what Jesus is talking to us about, but that Jesus can get pretty sneaky when he's telling a story. Have you noticed this? You gotta watch out for that guy, because if you don't, then you're going to jump too quickly to the conclusion you think is coming, and you're going to miss that sneaky little point Jesus slides in there at the bottom of the ninth. He seems to do it all the time, and today is no different. He lifts up these two people. There's a Pharisee and the tax collector. And a Pharisee, to our church ears, kind of sounds like maybe the villain, because we're so used to seeing Jesus debate them. But in ancient times, the Pharisee was the good, upstanding pillar of the community, the faithful, honest leader. A modern-day equivalent might be Pastor Ellery, or a nun, or something like that. I mean, that's the image that Jesus is conjuring with the Pharisee. And then the tax collector, well, it turns out that job wasn't very popular back then any more than it might be today. But the tax collector would have been kind of the shady character, the dishonest kind of one. And so when Jesus puts the ending on it that he does, and puts this twist on it, people are shocked. And we have to wonder, what's really going on here, Jesus? Are you just talking to us about humility, or are you getting at something deeper? Because what Jesus seems to be doing to me is lifting up the distinction between these two people, the Pharisee and the tax collector. He's lifting this up in front of us, and then he blurs the lines between them. These social rules and expectations, he's changing and reforming people's understanding of how God's grace operates in the world. And we have social distinctions in our lives all over the place, right? Many of them are helpful and healthy and necessary to know who we are in the world, to understand how we fit in a society. Things like, I am a member of my family, but I am not a member of your family. That's good to know, because you don't want me just showing up at Thanksgiving and saying, hi, I'm home. That would be awkward, right? We need social distinctions in our lives. I'm from Monticello, or I'm from Anamosa, or I'm from someplace else. Like, these things are good and helpful and help us order our lives in the society in which we live. But sometimes, especially in times of transition and change and chaos in the world, these social distinctions that are helpful and healthy start to get tainted and twisted and move beyond that into these lines drawn in the sand. These boundaries and walls that we put up that isolate and define who is in and who is out. And those boundaries had been clearly drawn in Jesus' day. He was living right in the midst of one of these hinge points in history, and those lines had been laid out, and the tax collector would have been way on the outside of those. I mean, the tax collector was a thief, a liar, a cheat, someone who abused their power, someone who took advantage of others for their own gain. A tax collector was someone who on a daily basis would have sold out their neighbors, their friends, even their very family to the enemy, to the Romans, just to make a buck. And so often tax collectors were actually Jewish people themselves who had kind of gone over to the other side. So this man, he knew where the line was. He knew where the boundaries of God's grace were, of what was acceptable, and he walked right on past them every day. I mean, this is a person who knowingly and willingly forfeited any place, any right he had to God's kingdom. And yet we read in the gospel these words of Jesus, of this tax collector. But he was standing far off. He would not even look up to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me. Please, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. In that moment, God's love eradicates any distinctions. God's love barrels through any boundaries that we might put up about who is in and who is out. Jesus changes the rules. Jesus transforms and reforms our understanding of how God's grace works in the world. And so even more than this exhortation about humility today, I think part of what Jesus is getting at is trying to help us to look and open our eyes to the social distinctions in our day and to see how these things affect our lives. I mean, are there places in your life where maybe you have drawn some lines in the sand that view people on the outside as maybe beyond hope or beyond redemption? If I'm honest, I find myself being way too often like that Pharisee, thinking, thank goodness I'm better than that, right? But God's love moves further than that. And on the flip side, I wonder, have any of us ever had these social boundaries and these expectations make us feel like the tax collector? Like we are on the outside, like we don't measure up. Like maybe some days we wonder if we're even worthy of coming in the doors of the church, and it's hard to even lift our eyes and our voice to God. Because in these times where change and fear and discomfort grow in our society, so too judgment and condemnation grow right along with it, and we feel the weight of that every single day. But whenever you might feel like the social distinctions, the rules and expectations have condemned you, God's love sees no distinctions. God's love sees no boundaries. When the rules and the things of society tell someone that they're on the outside, God's love is beyond that. Because God's love is always reforming. The world may change. The rules of society around us may seem to change, but God's love for you will never, ever fade. Because God is always breathing new life into even the most undeserving of us. Thanks be to God.